The rain had been falling for hours, each drop striking the window like a quiet percussion against the silence of my apartment. I sat in the blue glow of the television, the volume turned low enough that I could barely make out the dialogue from whatever film was playing. It didn't matter what it was. I wasn't really watching. The whiskey in my glass had gone warm some time ago, amber liquid catching the light from the screen as I held it loosely in my hand. I'd taken maybe 3 sips since pouring it, more ritual than desire. The apartment felt smaller at night, the walls pressing in with the weight of all the things I couldn't bring myself to think about during daylight hours. My phone lay face up on the coffee table, its screen illuminated with a text message thread that had been haunting me for the better part of an hour. Julian's name at the top, and below it, just 3 words that somehow carried the weight of everything unsaid between us. "Are you up?" The cursor blinked in the reply field, waiting. I'd started to type a dozen different responses, each one deleted before I could find the courage to send it. Yes. No. Why? Come over. Stay away. The simplicity of his question felt like a trap, or maybe an invitation. I couldn't tell which scared me more. I set the glass down and reached for the phone, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. The smart thing would be to turn it off, to let the message go unanswered until morning brought clarity and the safe distance of daylight. But my finger traced the edge of the screen instead, and suddenly I was somewhere else entirely. It had been 3 weeks ago, maybe 4. We'd been sitting on this same couch, laughing at something ridiculous in an old comedy neither of us had seen in years. Julian had brought it over on one of his increasingly frequent visits, claiming he'd found it in a box of things from his marriage that he was finally ready to sort through. The laughter had died down, and we'd settled into that comfortable quiet that sometimes falls between people who've known each other long enough to not need constant conversation. I remember the exact moment it happened. Julian had shifted slightly, reaching for his beer on the side table, and his hand had brushed against mine where it rested on the cushion between us. Not an accident, not quite. There had been a deliberation to it, a lingering that lasted just long enough for both of us to notice. I'd looked up to find him watching me with an expression I'd never seen before, surprise mixed with something deeper, something that made my chest tighten. Neither of us had moved away. We'd simply stayed there, hands barely touching, the space between us charged with a possibility that neither of us was brave enough to name. The moment had stretched until the laugh track from the television broke the spell, and we'd both pulled back as if waking from the same dream. I opened my eyes and found myself back in the present, the memory dissolving like smoke. The phone still glowed in my hand, Julian's message still waiting for an answer I didn't know how to give. Outside, the rain continued its steady rhythm against the glass, and I realized that somewhere in the space between that night and this one, everything had changed. The cushion beside me held the faint impression where he'd been sitting, and I found myself tracing the seam with my finger, following the path his hand had taken when it found mine. The gesture felt both like a comfort and a wound, a reminder of how close we'd come to crossing a line I wasn't sure either of us was ready to acknowledge existed. I turned the phone face down on the table and leaned back into the couch, letting the blue light wash over me as the credits began to roll on whatever movie I hadn't been watching. The apartment settled around me, quiet except for the rain and the distant hum of the refrigerator, and I tried not to think about how different this silence felt from the one we'd shared just a few weeks ago. My life had become a series of careful routines, each day unfolding with the predictable rhythm of a metronome. At 34, I taught American history at the local high school, the same building where I'd once sat in similar classrooms, dreaming of somewhere else. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd ended up exactly where I'd started, though I'd learned to call it choice rather than defeat. The town was the kind of place where everyone knew your story before you'd finished living it. One main street lined with shops that had been there since my childhood, their awnings faded but stubbornly persistent. A single movie theater that showed films months after they'd premiered elsewhere. One grocery store where Mrs. Henderson still asked about my mother every time I bought milk, even though my mother had been gone for 3 years. It was the kind of place where relationships were forged in high school and calcified over decades, where divorce was whispered about in church pews and coffee shops, where being alone at 34 meant well-meaning neighbors left casseroles on your doorstep with apologetic smiles. My marriage to Vanessa had ended 2 years ago with the kind of quiet dissolution that everyone called mature. We'd known each other since freshman year of college, dated through graduation, married because it seemed like the logical next step. The divorce papers had been signed in a lawyer's office that smelled like coffee and regret, both of us polite enough to shake hands afterward. She'd kept the house we'd bought together, the one with the white picket fence that had felt like playing dress-up in someone else's life. I'd moved into the apartment above the old pharmacy on 3rd Street, a space that came furnished with the previous tenant's loneliness and a view of the water tower. My days followed their predetermined path with religious precision. Morning jog at 6:30, shower, coffee black, lesson plans reviewed over toast I rarely finished. School from 8 to 3:15, grading papers until 5, dinner alone while reading or watching the news. Thursday nights meant grocery shopping at exactly 7 o'clock, when the store was empty enough that I could move through the aisles without having to make conversation about the weather or my health or whether I was seeing anyone. The apartment reflected this careful order. Books arranged by subject, dishes washed immediately after use, bed made every morning with hospital corners my father had taught me when I was 12. Everything in its place, everything controlled. It was easier that way, safer. Disorder meant possibility, and possibility meant risk. I'd been living in this measured quiet for 2 years when Julian reappeared. We'd known each other in college, part of the same loose circle of friends who'd gathered in dorm rooms to argue about music and philosophy and the weight of the world we thought we understood. Julian had been the one who could make everyone laugh, who knew how to diffuse tension with a perfectly timed joke or observation. He'd been easy to be around in the way that some people just are, comfortable in his own skin in a way I'd always envied. After graduation, we drifted as people do. Holiday cards for a few years, the occasional social media like updates filtered through mutual friends. He'd moved to Chicago, gotten married to someone named Sarah who worked in marketing and ran marathons. I'd heard about their wedding through someone else, had felt the strange pang that comes with realizing how thoroughly people can disappear from your life. His marriage had ended a year before mine, I learned later. Messier than mine, with lawyers and arguments about who got what. He'd moved back home to stay with his older brother David, sleeping on a couch that was too small for his frame, trying to figure out what came next. The first text had come on a Tuesday in September. Just my name and a question mark, as if he wasn't sure he had the right number. I'd stared at it for 10 minutes before responding, unsure what the appropriate level of enthusiasm was for reconnecting with someone who'd once known you well enough to finish your sentences. We'd met for coffee at the diner on Main Street, sitting across from each other in a booth with cracked vinyl seats and the kind of fluorescent lighting that made everyone look tired. He looked older, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there in college, but his smile was the same. That easy warmth that had always made him magnetic. He asked about my teaching, my life, whether I was happy. I gave him the polished answers I'd perfected over the years, the ones that made everything sound more fulfilling than it was. He told me about Chicago, about the divorce, about feeling like he was starting over at 33 with nothing to show for the last decade, except some furniture he didn't want and a savings account that had been split down the middle. There was something different about him, though. A restlessness that hadn't been there before, a way of looking around the diner, as if he was surprised to find himself back in a place he'd once been so eager to leave. When he laughed, it sounded genuine but fragile, like something that might break if handled too roughly. Before leaving, he'd asked if I wanted to grab a beer sometime. Maybe catch a movie. For old time's sake, he'd said, and something in the way he said it made me agree before I'd had time to consider whether it was wise. That was how it started. Casual texts about meeting up, shared beers at the bar near the college, conversations that picked up threads from 20 years ago, as if no time had passed at all. It felt good to talk to someone who remembered who I'd been before I'd become so careful, so measured. Someone who could still make me laugh without thinking about it first. It was a Thursday evening in late October when everything shifted. I'd just finished grading a stack of essays on the Civil War, red ink bleeding across pages filled with half-formed thoughts about battles and dates that meant nothing to 17-year-olds. The apartment was quiet except for the radiator's intermittent clanking, a sound I'd grown to find oddly comforting in its reliability. The knock on my door came without warning, 3 soft raps that barely registered over the radiator's protest. I wasn't expecting anyone. In 2 years of living here, unexpected visitors were as rare as snow in July. I opened the door to find Julian standing in the hallway, a DVD case in his hand and something like uncertainty in his eyes. He held up the movie like evidence. It was an old film we'd watched countless times in college. One of those late-night discoveries that had become part of our shared language back when we thought we were the first people to ever understand cinema. The case was worn at the edges, clearly pulled from some forgotten box. "I found this going through some old stuff," he said. "Thought maybe we could watch it." For old time's sake. There was something in his voice that made it impossible to say no, though I couldn't name what it was. A vulnerability, maybe, or just the simple weight of nostalgia. I stepped aside and let him in, closing the door behind him with the feeling that I was sealing something in or out. I wasn't sure which. He moved through my space with an ease that surprised me, settling onto the couch as if he'd done it 100 times before. I put the movie in and dimmed the lights, muscle memory from countless nights that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. When I sat down beside him, there was the normal amount of space between us, the distance that politeness and 20 years of social conditioning demanded. But as the opening credits rolled, I became aware of Julian in a way that felt new and unsettling. The way he laughed at jokes we'd memorized decades ago, the unconscious way he shifted closer during quieter scenes, the heat that seemed to radiate from his presence beside me. When his knee brushed against mine during a particularly tense moment in the film, I told myself it was an accident. When it happened again 10 minutes later, I began to suspect otherwise. That first night felt like a test neither of us was sure we were taking. The movie played, but I found myself watching Julian more than the screen, cataloging the small changes time had carved into his face, the way his hands moved when he talked, the sound of his breathing in the spaces between dialogue. When the credits rolled, he didn't immediately get up to leave. Instead, we sat in the afterglow of the television, talking about nothing and everything in the way that only happens in the small hours of the night. He told me about his brother's couch, how it was too short and left him waking up with a crick in his neck every morning. I found myself offering to let him crash here any time he needed a better night's sleep, the words leaving my mouth before I'd fully considered their implications. He thanked me with a smile that lingered longer than necessary, and when he finally left, the apartment felt emptier than it had before he'd arrived. The second time he came over, 3 nights later, he brought a different movie but the same easy presence. This time, when he settled onto the couch, he sat slightly closer. Not obviously so, just enough that I was constantly aware of the narrow strip of space between us, the way that space seemed to hum with potential energy. By the third visit, it had become an unspoken routine. Julian would text sometime after 8, usually just a simple question mark or the title of whatever film he'd unearthed from his collection. I'd respond with my address as if he might have forgotten, as if this wasn't becoming as essential to my weeks as grocery shopping or grading papers. Each time, he sat a little closer. Each time, the casual contact became slightly less casual, a knee that lingered against mine during an action sequence. His arms stretched along the back of the couch, close enough that I could feel the warmth of it behind my shoulders. The brush of his fingers when we both reached for the bowl of popcorn I'd started making, as if feeding us both had become my responsibility. I began to prepare for these evenings in ways I didn't want to examine too closely. I'd choose movies for their lighting, preferring the soft glow of romantic comedies to the harsh flicker of thrillers. I'd adjust the thermostat a few degrees higher, making the room warm enough that blankets felt unnecessary, but somehow always ended up draped across both our laps anyway. I'd pour 2 glasses of whiskey without being asked, had learned that Julian preferred his neat, liked the way he'd cup the glass in both hands as if warming himself with it. The catalyst came on a Friday night in November, rain drumming against the windows with the kind of persistence that made the world feel smaller, more intimate. Julian had brought over a drama I'd never seen. Something European with subtitles that required us to sit closer to read the words at the bottom of the screen. Halfway through the film, during a scene where two characters embraced in what the director clearly intended as a moment of profound connection, Julian's hand found mine on the cushion between us. Not the accidental brush of fingers that had become our unspoken language, but a deliberate interlacing of palms and fingers that made my breath catch in my throat. I should have pulled away. Should have made some excuse about needing another drink or checking that I'd locked the front door. Instead, I sat perfectly still, afraid that any movement might break whatever spell had settled over us. Julian's thumb traced a slow circle against the back of my hand. Such a simple gesture that somehow felt more intimate than anything I'd experienced in years. Neither of us looked at each other. We kept our eyes fixed on the screen, watching subtitled dialogue we weren't really reading, pretending that this moment wasn't happening even as it rewrote the fundamental nature of our friendship. The characters on screen continued their story, but all I could focus on was the weight of Julian's hand in mine, the way our breathing had synchronized without either of us trying, the electric current that seemed to run from his fingertips straight through to my chest. When the movie ended, we didn't let go immediately. We sat through the credits, watching names scroll past in a foreign language, both of us afraid to be the first to acknowledge what had just happened. Finally, Julian squeezed my hand once, gently, before releasing it and reaching for his coat. He thanked me for the evening as he always did, but this time his voice carried something different. A wait, maybe, or a question. I watched him walk to his car through the rain, and when I closed the door behind him, I had to lean against it for support, my legs suddenly unsteady beneath me. That night, I lay awake until dawn, replaying the feeling of his hand in mine, the careful way he'd held it, as if it were something precious and fragile. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that it was just the comfortable intimacy of old friends watching a movie on a rainy night. But even as I constructed these reasonable explanations, I knew something fundamental had shifted between us, something that couldn't be unnamed or undone. After that Friday night, something invisible but undeniable had settled between us. Julian continued to visit, and I continued to let him in, but now every gesture carried weight. When he sat down beside me, his knee would find mine with what felt like magnetic inevitability. When he reached across me for the remote, his arm would linger against my chest just long enough for both of us to notice. When he laughed at something on screen, his head would tip back against the couch cushion, and I would find myself studying the line of his throat in the dim light. We never spoke about it. This new language we developed existed entirely in the spaces between words, in the careful choreography of two people learning to touch without acknowledging what they were doing. His arm began to rest along the back of the couch behind my shoulders, not quite embracing, but close enough that I could feel the warmth of it through my shirt. I started sitting closer to him than the size of the couch required, our thighs pressed together from knee to hip while we pretended to focus on whatever film was playing. I found myself preparing for his visits with an attention to detail that would have embarrassed me if I'd allowed myself to think about it too clearly. I'd spend 20 minutes choosing what to wear, settling on shirts that were soft to the touch, jeans that fit well without trying too hard. I'd select movies not for their plots, but for their lighting, preferring the golden glow of period dramas to the harsh blue flicker of science fiction. I kept the overhead lights off, relying instead on the warm pool of light from a single lamp that cast everything in honey-colored shadows. The apartment itself began to transform around these evenings. I bought softer throw pillows, a blanket that was large enough to cover both of us without either having to ask. I stocked better whiskey, learned to keep the bottles that Julian preferred within easy reach. The coffee table acquired a permanent bowl for popcorn, tissues for when we watched something sad, a collection of coasters that we never actually used because we were usually too distracted to remember them. Our conversations during these nights grew deeper, more honest than they'd ever been in college. Julian told me about the loneliness that had settled into his bones during the last years of his marriage, how he'd felt like a stranger in his own life. He described nights spent lying awake next to someone who felt more like a roommate than a wife. The slow erosion of intimacy until they were just two people sharing space and bills and nothing else. I found myself telling him things I'd never said aloud. About the hollow feeling that had followed me through my divorce. The way I'd wake up some mornings forgetting that Vanessa was gone, and then remembering with a weight that felt like drowning. About how I'd built this careful, ordered life not because it made me happy but because it was safe, predictable, a way of moving through the world without having to risk feeling anything too deeply. There were moments when our laughter would fade into something quieter, more charged. Julian would make a joke and I'd smile, and then we'd both fall silent, looking at each other in the lamplight with an intensity that made my chest tight. His eyes would linger on my face as if he was trying to memorize something, and I'd find myself doing the same, cataloging the way the light caught the gray that was starting to thread through his hair, the lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled. The silences between us began to hum with meaning, not uncomfortable, but full of everything we weren't saying. We'd sit there, shoulders touching, hands occasionally brushing when we reached for our drinks, and the air would feel thick with possibility. Sometimes Julian would open his mouth as if he was about to say something important, then close it again and turn back to the screen. Sometimes I'd catch myself leaning toward him, drawn by some gravitational pull I couldn't name or control. The tension grew slowly, like water rising behind a dam. Each visit added another layer, another moment of contact that lasted just long enough to feel intentional. Julian started staying later, until the movies ended well past midnight, and we'd sit in the credits talking until nearly dawn. He'd fall asleep sometimes, his head dropping to my shoulder, and I'd sit perfectly still, afraid to wake him, afraid to move and break whatever spell had allowed this to happen. On the nights when he did go home, I'd lie awake replaying every touch, every look, every moment when the space between us had felt electric with possibility. I'd tell myself I was imagining things, that this was just the comfortable intimacy of old friends reconnecting. But my body knew better. It knew the difference between casual contact and something deliberate, something that was building toward a conclusion neither of us was brave enough to name. By December, the anticipation had become almost unbearable. I'd find myself counting the hours until Julian's next visit, planning conversations, choosing movies that might create the right atmosphere for whatever was growing between us. I'd catch myself checking my reflection before he arrived, smoothing my hair, making sure I looked like someone worth sitting close to in the dark. And through it all, Julian seemed to be going through his own transformation. The restlessness I'd noticed when he first returned had settled into something more focused, more intentional. When he looked at me now, it was with an attention that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Like he was really looking, really paying attention to who I was rather than who he expected me to be. We were both changing, I realized. Becoming different versions of ourselves in the warm bubble of those evening hours, discovering parts of ourselves that had been sleeping or hiding or simply waiting for the right moment to emerge. And whatever was happening between us felt both inevitable and impossible, like standing at the edge of a cliff and knowing that eventually, one of us was going to have to decide whether to jump. The night it finally happened was a Tuesday in mid-December, the kind of cold that seeps through windows and settles in your bones despite the radiator's best efforts. Julian had arrived with snow dusting his shoulders and a movie I'd never heard of, something he'd found in his brother's collection that he thought I might like. It was a quiet drama about two people finding each other in the aftermath of loss, the kind of film that demands attention rather than serving as background noise. We'd settled into our usual positions on the couch, that careful distance that had become smaller with each visit but still maintained the pretense of casual friendship. Julian had chosen the wine that night instead of whiskey, something red that warmed us from the inside and made the lamplight seem softer, more forgiving. The apartment felt smaller than usual, more intimate, as if the cold outside had compressed our world down to just this room, this couch, this space we'd created between us. The movie was beautifully shot, all golden hour lighting and lingering glances between actors who understood the weight of silence. About an hour in, there was a scene where the two main characters found themselves alone in a kitchen after a family gathering, the exhaustion of maintaining facades finally wearing them down. They stood facing each other across a small space, and you could see the exact moment when they both stopped pretending they were just friends. It happened slowly on screen. The man reached out first, his hand finding the woman's cheek with a tenderness that made something in my chest clench. She leaned into the touch, her eyes closing as if she'd been waiting for permission to stop being strong. Then they were embracing, not with passion, but with the kind of desperate relief that comes from finally being allowed to need someone. That's when Julian's hand found mine. Not the casual brush of fingers we'd grown accustomed to, not the accidental contact that we could both pretend meant nothing. This was deliberate, purposeful, his palm sliding against mine with a slowness that made every nerve ending in my body come alive. His fingers threaded through mine with the careful precision of someone who had thought about this moment, planned for it, waited for exactly the right time to make it real. I stopped breathing. I'm certain of it, because suddenly I was hyper-aware of everything else in the room. The soft dialogue from the television, the whisper of snow against the windows, the sound of Julian's breathing beside me, slightly uneven as if he was nervous or excited or both. The weight of his hand in mine felt enormous, like holding something fragile and precious that could shatter if I moved wrong. I didn't pull away. That choice felt as significant as any I'd ever made, a conscious decision to step over a line we'd both been dancing around for months. Julian's thumb began to move against the side of my hand, tracing slow circles that sent shivers up my arm and straight to my chest. The touch was so gentle it was almost tentative, as if he was asking a question with his fingertips and waiting for my answer. On screen, the two characters were still embracing, but I could barely focus on them anymore. All of my attention had narrowed down to the places where Julian's skin touched mine, the warmth that seemed to radiate from our joined hands and spread through my entire body. This wasn't the comfortable intimacy of old friends. This was something else entirely, something that made my pulse race and my thoughts scatter like leaves in the wind. Neither of us looked at each other. We kept our eyes fixed on the television as if our lives depended on following the plot, but I knew Julian was as aware of me as I was of him. I could feel it in the careful way he held my hand, firm enough to make his intentions clear, but gentle enough that I could pull away if I wanted to. The fact that I didn't want to, that every fiber of my being was focused on maintaining this connection, felt like a revelation in itself. The movie continued around us, but I couldn't tell you what happened next in the story. My entire world had condensed down to the feeling of Julian's thumb moving against my skin, the way our fingers fit together as if they'd been designed for this exact purpose. Time seemed to slow and speed up simultaneously. Seconds felt like hours, but also like the movie was ending too quickly, like this moment would be over before I'd had time to fully understand what it meant. When the credits finally began to roll, neither of us moved to turn on the lights or reach for the remote. We sat in the blue glow of the television, our hands still intertwined, the silence between us thick with everything we weren't saying. I could feel Julian's pulse against my palm, fast and strong, matching the rhythm of my own heartbeat. The air in the room felt charged, electric, as if lightning might strike at any moment. I wanted to turn and look at him, to see if his face showed the same mixture of wonder and terror that I was feeling, but I was afraid that breaking the spell might make him realize what we were doing and pull away. So I sat perfectly still, memorizing the feeling of his hand in mine, the way the lamplight caught the wedding ring tan line that was finally starting to fade on his finger, the sound of his breathing in the quiet room. Finally, I found the courage to turn toward him. Julian was already looking at me, his eyes soft and serious in the dim light, and I opened my mouth to say something, anything, to acknowledge what had just happened between us. But the words caught in my throat, too big and too small all at once for what I was feeling. Julian's free hand came up to my face, his fingers brushing against my cheek with the same careful tenderness he'd been showing my hand. His thumb traced the line of my jaw, and I found myself leaning into the touch the same way the actress had on screen, as if I'd been waiting my entire life for someone to touch me like this. In that moment, looking into Julian's eyes while he held my face in one hand and my hand in the other, I finally understood what had been building between us all these months. This wasn't confusion or loneliness or the simple comfort of physical contact. This was recognition. Julian was seeing me, really seeing me, in a way that felt both terrifying and necessary. And more than that, I could see in his expression that he was feeling the same things I was, that this overwhelming sense of rightness and possibility and fear wasn't just in my imagination. He felt it too. Whatever this was, wherever it was leading, I wasn't alone in it. The relief of that realization was so intense it made my eyes water, and Julian's expression softened even further, as if he could read the emotion on my face. We stayed like that for a long time, just looking at each other in the lamplight, his hand warm against my cheek and our fingers still intertwined. The snow continued to fall outside, and the apartment grew quieter around us, but inside this small bubble of warmth and light and sudden understanding, everything felt possible. Dangerous, yes, and complicated in ways I wasn't ready to think about, but possible in a way that made my chest feel too small to contain everything I was feeling. When Julian finally spoke, his voice was so quiet I almost missed it. He said my name, just my name, but the way he said it made it sound like a prayer or a promise or both. And I knew, with the kind of certainty that changes everything, that we had just crossed a line from which there would be no going back. 3 days passed without a word from Julian. 3 days of checking my phone every few minutes, of listening for footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment, of sitting on the couch each evening with a movie queued up that I never actually started. The silence felt different from the comfortable quiet we'd shared during our evenings together. This was loaded, heavy with questions I was afraid to ask, and answers I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. Thursday came and went without his usual text. Friday evening arrived with its promise of the weekend, but my phone remained stubbornly dark. By Saturday night, I was pacing the length of my small apartment like a caged animal, wearing a path in the carpet between the kitchen and the living room window where I could watch the street below for any sign of his car. I told myself he was busy, that his brother needed help with something, that work had gotten complicated. But the rational explanations felt hollow against the weight of what had happened between us on Tuesday night. The memory of his hand in mine, of the way he'd touched my face like I was something precious, played on repeat in my mind until I thought I might lose what was left of my sanity. The worst part was the growing realization that I couldn't go back to the way things were before. The careful distance we'd maintained, the unspoken boundaries, the comfortable pretense that we were just old friends reconnecting. All of that had been shattered the moment Julian threaded his fingers through mine. I'd felt something shift inside me that night, some fundamental understanding of who I was and what I wanted that I couldn't unknown or unfeel. I'd spent 34 years moving through life with a kind of careful numbness, protecting myself from feeling too much or wanting too deeply. My marriage to Vanessa had been safe, predictable, built on shared histories and compatible goals rather than the kind of desperate need that made people do foolish things. I'd convinced myself that was enough, that the steady warmth of companionship was all anyone could reasonably expect from love. But 3 days without Julian had shown me how wrong I'd been. The ache in my chest felt like withdrawal, like my body was remembering what it meant to need someone and rebelling against their absence. I found myself checking the spots where he usually sat, running my fingers over the cushions where the warmth of his body had pressed against mine. The apartment felt enormous and empty, every corner echoing with the sound of conversations we'd shared and silences that had meant everything. Sunday afternoon brought a knock on my door that made my heart stop entirely. I opened it to find Julian standing in the hallway, but he looked different. Guarded in a way I hadn't seen since our first awkward coffee at the diner months ago. His shoulders were tense, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, and he wouldn't quite meet my eyes when he asked if he could come in. I stepped aside wordlessly, closing the door behind him with the feeling that whatever happened next would determine everything. Julian didn't move toward the couch where we'd spent so many evenings building this thing between us. Instead, he stayed near the door, shifting his weight from foot to foot like he might bolt at any moment. The silence stretched between us, but this time it wasn't comfortable or charged with possibility. This was the kind of quiet that comes before difficult conversations, heavy with the weight of words that needed to be said, but that neither of us wanted to voice. I couldn't take it anymore. The careful dance we'd been doing, the unspoken agreements to never name what was happening between us, all of it felt suddenly ridiculous and unsustainable. If Julian was going to run, if this was going to end before it had really begun, I needed to know. I needed him to say it clearly instead of leaving me to guess at his intentions. "What are we doing, Julian?" The words came out rougher than I'd intended, months of careful restraint finally cracking under the pressure of uncertainty. I watched his face as he processed the question, saw the way his jaw tightened, and his eyes finally met mine with something that looked like relief and terror in equal measure. He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, as if saying the words too loudly might make them more real than he was ready for them to be. He told me he was confused, that he'd been thinking about Tuesday night nonstop since it happened. He said he'd never thought about himself this way before, never questioned the assumptions he'd built his life around, but that something about being with me had made all of those certainties feel suddenly fragile. I watched him struggle with the words, could see how much it cost him to admit to confusion about something as fundamental as who he was and what he wanted. Julian had always been the kind of person who seemed to know exactly where he stood, who moved through the world with an easy confidence that I'd envied in college. Seeing him vulnerable like this, watching him grapple with questions that had no easy answers, made something protective and tender rise up in my chest. He told me that he hadn't been able to stop thinking about me, about the way my hand had felt in his, about the expression on my face when he'd touched my cheek. He said he'd tried to convince himself it was just loneliness, just the natural intimacy that comes from two people who'd known each other for 20 years finding comfort in familiar company. But he couldn't make himself believe it anymore. The honesty in his voice, the raw vulnerability of his admission, made my earlier anger dissolve entirely. This wasn't rejection or abandonment. This was Julian trying to figure out how to be brave enough to want something he'd never let himself want before. I could feel us standing at the edge of something irreversible, a moment where we could either step back into the safety of ambiguity or move forward into territory that neither of us had mapped before. The choice felt enormous, weighted with all the ways it could change everything between us, all the ways it could go wrong. But looking at Julian's face, seeing the fear and hope warring in his expression, I realized that the choice had already been made. It had been made Tuesday night when I didn't pull away from his touch, when I let myself lean into the feeling of being seen and wanted by someone whose presence had become essential to my happiness. It had been made during 3 days of missing him with an intensity that scared me, of understanding finally what it meant to need someone not just for comfort, but for the simple fact of their existence in the world. I stepped toward him then, crossing the space between us with deliberate slowness, giving him time to retreat if that's what he needed. But Julian didn't move away. He stayed perfectly still as I reached for his hand, the same careful gesture he'd made toward me days earlier, but this time in the full light of the afternoon sun streaming through my windows. When our fingers touched, when his hand closed around mine, with that same gentle certainty he'd shown in the dark, I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't realized had been holding its breath. This was the choice, then, not the safe distance of careful friendship, but this terrifying, necessary thing that we were finally brave enough to name. A week later, rain fell against the windows again with the same persistent rhythm that had provided the soundtrack to so many of our evenings together. The apartment looked exactly the same. The couch with its worn cushions, the stack of DVDs that had grown taller over the months, the lamp casting its familiar pool of warm light across the coffee table. But everything was different now, changed in ways both subtle and profound. Julian sat beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched without either of us having to think about it. The careful choreography of our previous visits had been replaced by something simpler, more honest. When he shifted to get more comfortable, his movement was natural, unconscious, the way people move when they know they belong exactly where they are. We'd chosen a movie neither of us had seen before, something recommended by the clerk at the video store who insisted we'd like it. But 20 minutes in, neither of us was really watching. Instead, we were learning this new language of touch that didn't require hiding or justification. Julian's hand rested on my knee with casual ownership, his thumb occasionally moving against the fabric of my jeans in absent patterns that sent warmth spreading through my chest. The blanket we shared was one I'd bought years ago but never used, something soft and oversized that I'd kept folded in the closet for guests who never came. Now it draped over both our legs, creating a small world underneath where our bodies pressed together without apology. Julian's warmth seeped through the layers of cotton and denim, and I found myself marveling at how natural this felt, how right it was to be close to someone without having to justify every point of contact. On the coffee table, 2 glasses of whiskey sat side by side, the amber liquid catching the lamplight. Julian had poured them both when he arrived, a small ritual that felt like coming home. No longer the careful distance of acquaintances sharing a drink, but the easy intimacy of 2 people who belonged in each other's space. The conversation had been quieter tonight, less of the nervous energy that had marked our previous weeks of circling around each other. We talked about small things, his plans to find his own apartment, my upcoming winter break from school, the way the snow was supposed to start falling by morning. But underneath the ordinary words was something new, certainty. The anxious question marks that had punctuated every interaction for months had been replaced by something that felt like peace. I thought about the conversation we'd had 3 days after that Sunday afternoon, when Julian had stood by my door looking lost and scared. We'd talked then about what this meant, about the labels people might want to put on what was happening between us, about the complications that came with changing the fundamental understanding of who you were at 34. But somehow, in the talking, we discovered that none of those things mattered as much as the simple fact that we made each other happy. Julian shifted beside me, settling deeper into the couch and pulling me with him until my head rested against his shoulder. The movement was so natural it might have been choreographed, and I let my eyes close for a moment, breathing in the scent of his cologne mixed with the faint smell of the snow that clung to his jacket. This wasn't the desperate passion of movies or novels, the kind of love that burned bright and demanded everything at once. This was something quieter, more sustainable. It was Julian's hand finding mine in the dark of the movie theater when we'd gone out last weekend, fingers intertwining without either of us having to look. It was the way he'd started keeping a toothbrush in my bathroom cabinet, a small concession to the fact that he was spending more nights on my couch than his brothers. It was the comfortable silence that had replaced the charged tension of our earlier evenings, the way we could simply exist in each other's presence without needing to constantly negotiate the space between us. The movie played on, but I was more interested in the steady rhythm of Julian's breathing beneath my ear, the way his chest rose and fell in a pattern that was already becoming familiar. His free hand came up to rest in my hair, fingers combing through it with the kind of absent affection that spoke of belonging rather than desire. Outside, the rain continued its gentle percussion against the glass, and I thought about all the evenings we'd spent in this room, all the careful steps that had led us to this moment of simple peace. The journey felt both impossibly long and surprisingly short, months of circling around each other condensed into the space between one heartbeat and the next. Julian's voice broke the comfortable quiet, soft enough that I almost missed it over the sound of the rain. He said my name, just my name, the same way he had that first night when everything changed. But this time there was no question in it, no uncertainty, just acknowledgement, recognition, the kind of quiet gratitude that comes from finally being exactly where you're supposed to be. I lifted my head to look at him, and found him watching me with an expression I was still learning to read. Contentment, maybe, or wonder at how simple this had turned out to be once we'd stopped fighting it. His hand came up to my face, thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone with the same careful tenderness he'd shown that first night, but now without the fear of overstepping invisible boundaries. We didn't need to say anything else. The words we'd needed to speak had been spoken. The choices that had to be made had been made. What remained was this: the weight of Julian's hand in mine, the soft sound of his breathing, the way the lamplight caught the gray in his hair and made everything look golden and warm and permanent. Outside, the rain fell steadily against the windows, and I let my eyes close again, settling more fully against Julian's shoulder with the knowledge that I could stay there as long as I wanted. Our hands rested openly between us on the blanket, fingers intertwined in the kind of contact that no longer needed to be hidden or explained or justified to anyone, including ourselves. This was enough. More than enough. It was everything.